Congressman Pallone, 6th District, distinguished member and messenger. You like some time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the committee for holding this hearing, and it's a very serious matter. I'll try to be brief. You have my written testimony, which I'll ask you to include in the record in its entirety. What led Congressman Pascrell and me to introduce legislation is because we saw all the inconsistencies and lack of proper oversight of monitors. And I believe that without a legislative fix, basically U.S. attorneys will continue to write their own rules. And that leads to a broad spectrum of practices, often bad practices, from U.S. attorneys dictating to the company who the monitor will be, how much they will charge, and all the other things that have come up today. The troubling thing is that federal prosecutors have too much discretion in appointing these corporate monitors, allowing an unelected official unfettered leverage against companies and corporations who have potentially engaged in criminal behavior invites the type of abuse our judicial system is designed to prevent. Now, I want to mention briefly, Congressman Pascrell and I went to a day at NYU Law School that was totally devoted to this issue. And the interesting thing about it was they were talking about all kinds of deferred prosecutions. There was no question that the poster child for abuse was Mr. Christie. The fact that he hired his former boss, Mr. Ashcroft, in one case, that another former federal judge who was retired was hired as a monitor in another case, and then basically kicked back or sent thousands of dollars in election contributions to his campaign in his second case. And the third case with Seton Hall Law School that had nothing to do with the actual case in front of her, with the deferred prosecution, was given and endowed professorships. These are the kinds of abuses if there's unfettered discretion. In other words, someone just comes in and says, look, I can do whatever I want, and I will do these kinds of things unless there's some kind of limitations. And if anybody tells you that that somehow, you know, he wasn't in charge of how much money was going out, I mean, that email that you saw between Zimmer Holdings, you know, in the Ashcroft case, where they were complaining to Christie and his assistant about how, you know, we're not getting paid enough, was a perfect example of what goes on. They're actually going back to the U.S. attorney and saying, we're not getting paid enough, and can you intercede here to try to resolve this so that ultimately we get paid more. When Mr. Pascrell talked about the bills, this came up at the NYU conference that day, and it was just unbelievable how the one woman, Deborah Yang, was actually there, talked about how she had itemized her bills to justify the time and the billable hours that she put in. But in Ashcroft's case, he just submitted a memo and basically didn't justify it at all. So, I mean, this is the problem that we're having. If you don't step in and we don't pass some kind of legislation, you're going to have these kinds of abuses continue, and I think they could only get worse if you have somebody as the U.S. attorney who feels that he can do whatever he wants in almost dictatorial fashion. Now, I'm just going to end with this, Mr. Chairman. There's so many unanswered questions in the case of these cases that were handled by Christie, and I just want to list some of them if I can, and then I'll conclude. How much was John Ashcroft paid after you selected him as a monitor? Why did you fail to disclose how much Ashcroft and other monitors were paid? How did you decide to give Ashcroft the contract? Did you use any objective criteria, such as the bidding process? How many candidates did you have for the Ashcroft deal and for the other monitors? What were their names? What kinds of due diligence were performed on each candidate to avoid conflicts of interest? What types of billing records did you require of Mr. Ashcroft and the other monitors? What criteria is in place to determine if the monitor does the job right? Why do you believe there is no conflict of interest in granting David Kelly a monitoring contract after he decided not to prosecute your brother? Are you going to return the campaign contributions from John Inglesino? Are you going to return the contributions to Herb Stern? Why aren't these forms of pay to play? What sets you apart from the other prosecutors who use competitive bids, judges, and/or written criteria to select monitors? When we were at NYU that day, there were many other U.S. attorneys who actually used transparency, went to a judge to approve it, chose from a list of experts, didn't use their friends, didn't give the money to their own alma mater, didn't supervise, you know, how much money they were getting, as you saw in these emails. So the problem is, if you don't move on some sort of legislation like what we're proposing, yes, you will have good people that U.S. attorneys that use a transparent process, that pick from a list of experts, that don't hire their friends. But then you will have the Chris Christies who will do exactly the opposite because it's in their political interest to select their friends, make sure they get big fees, and continue these unfettered practices. So all we're asking is that you consider this legislation. I know you are seriously considering it because we're really concerned that without it, there is no objectivity and there's a lot more potential for abuse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. There's a minute 56 to go. I'd like to adjourn the panel so that we can go vote. Mr. Franks, you have a question? I don't know if we're going to come back to you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not. We can defer coming back or just not come back at all. But I would like to say that there's been a lot of statements here made that Mr. Christie hired. This is just all nonsense, and I'm sorry that it has to be that way. But I suppose it would take us all day to try to correct all the nonsense that's been put forth here from these two New Jersey members, who I respect. But I'm sorry that there's always a witch hunt on this committee. And with that, if you want to come back, I'd be glad to come back. And
Mr. Pascal.
Chairman,
yes, sir.
Mr. Pallone and I set out on this journey a year and a half ago. It's had nothing to do with politics. All we want is answer to the questions, and we put legislation before the committee in good faith. We're ready to defend the legislation, and particularly in terms of what you hear. If you step back from the politics of you want transparency. I know, Mr. Franks, you've always talked about transparency. That's what we want, and we're willing to work with you on this legislation. This system is not working, I can assure you. Forget about us. You make the judgment. You look at the materials. Thank you.
Move to we adjourn. I'd like to thank the witnesses. Objection 5 days. Right here. Adjourned.